Joining us now is Kendall Kaut to talk Baylor and the Big 12. Kendall, how you doing? Thanks so much for taking the time.
Doing well. Happy to be on with the Joshes.
Thank you very much. I think you're the first person that's ever referred to us on the podcast that way. So you made a little bit of history. We appreciate it. Before we get into this season in particular and kind of set the stage, we also wanted to ask quickly, you wrote a book. It's called How They Drew It Up, about that Baylor national championship team. What was that experience like for you, and kind of how did it further inform, change the way you kind of view this Baylor program as you now continue to see Scott Drew have success and kind of see the other side of what happens after you win a national championship?
Yep. So it was a really fun process, Josh. It was during the COVID season. So not a lot going on some nights, not a lot going on in my life, maybe a lot of nights, but particularly during that run. And so I got the opportunity to, Zoom press conferences. They'd have one a week with the team. They'd have one after every game. Got to interview just about every player and write a profile on them. And then during the book process, got pretty close to one of the assistant coaches on the team, a few of the GAs. So you kind of get the nitty gritty of what goes on during the season. What do they worry about? So a little bit more behind the curtains than you might get normally. So I loved the process. One of the best times in my life and one of the happiest times covering those 2021 Bears and then writing the book about them.
What was we it can serve as a sneak peek of what might be in the book. What's one of the coolest things that you learned throughout the duration of your writing process?
Yep. So Josh, I think what I learned during the process was kind of the mutual respect Baylor and Gonzaga really had for each other all year. That year, it was pretty clear most of the year. It was 1A, 1B, Baylor, Gonzaga. A few fools, I think, at the end of the year were like, oh, is Illinois for real? And then Loyola, housed them in the round of 32. But it was pretty clear all year Baylor, Gonzaga were the two teams. And just that mutual respect they had for each other. I had talked to John Jacobs, who's now Baylor's associate head coach, along with Al Brooks, before the original Baylor-Gonzaga game that was scheduled for that December. Illinois had, pretty strict COVID rules. And when one guy tested positive, game was off. And so in preparation for that game, I talked to Jacobs, and he was just like, when we played Gonzaga, we were going to front the post. We were going to make them beat us. We were going to say anybody but Drew Timme is going to beat us. And then game comes 4 months later. They do that exact same strategy, roll it out. It works well. So I think knowing going in is what Baylor's going to do was a pretty cool part of the book. And then making sure when I wrote previews, hey, don't tip my hand. I mean, I assume what the heck's Mark Few going to do? Read me. But I just wanted to make sure I didn't tip anything before that game.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And going into sort of this season and looking at this Baylor team, last year was sort of strange. You're coming off a national championship. You're sort of reworking some things, and then there are all of these injuries, and it was just sort of a strange season, I feel like, for Baylor. So now that you've had some time to reflect, what do you make of last season and kind of what it might tell you about this team? Of course, there are some new pieces coming in we're going to get to, but sort of what this season might look like and what you feel like this team learned from last year.
If not for the original COVID year, it really would have been the ultimate what-if season. Jonathan Tchamwa doesn't play the final 5 Big 12 games, still wins co-Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. That's how dominant he was. So without him, not quite the same team. James Akinjo injures his tailbone, shoots 30% from three on the season when he was over 40% for most of the year. And then Adam Flagler's battling a knee injury. And so that Baylor team, kind of the elite level they thought they could be, didn't quite hit it, and they ran into North Carolina at the exact wrong time. So really a question about him at that level. But I think the benefit for them is Adam Flagler worked all summer to kind of train his body, spent some time with Jared Butler in Houston. I think that development bodes well for Baylor because he's likely to be the point guard for most of the season. So hopefully the injuries end up being a blessing in disguise for what last year's Baylor team couldn't do. It makes it more likely that with LJ Cryer back from injury, Adam Flagler there, and then maybe John gets healthy by the end of the year, they can do what they did 2 years ago and what they weren't able to do last year.
Do you think we've gotten to the point with Baylor that we are at with some of the more traditional blue bloods where the expectation going into this season is just kind of on a different level? Like, if there's any way that you can suggest that Kansas or Kentucky or North Carolina or Duke is going to have a special season, that typically is the narrative going into this season, and then everybody else is kind of on the fringe. And then in the really special seasons, right, they're considered title contenders. But at this point, do you think Scott Drew has gotten the program to the point where the default almost is Baylor's going to be a team that has a chance to be a top 5, top 10 team in the country and really compete for national titles on an annual basis?
I think it certainly should be in the short term. Baylor, I think, has kind of hit that level over the last 4 or 5 years. It's sort of where KU was, where the Jayhawks went below a 2 seed for like 8 straight NCAA tournaments. The Bears, had they played the 2020 NCAA tournament, I feel pretty confident would have been a 1 seed. They won 23 straight Big 12 games, which is still the record for most consecutive games won by a Big 12 team. You look at teams that have won or earned number 1 NCAA seeds 3 years in a row. Only 8 universities have ever achieved that feat, which includes Gonzaga, which is active in that streak. So it's a very high benchmark to hit. Keontae George is a top 10 recruit, probably going to be a top 10 pick in the next NBA draft. Trey Johnson just visited Baylor. If there's not an early NBA entry, whether that's the 24 draft or the 25 draft, he looks like he's got a shot to come to Baylor. So I think Baylor's reloaded well. The challenge, if you get to that level, is do you have a year where maybe you dip like Kentucky does sometimes? North Carolina had a few years like that under Roy that were a little lean, but you're winning, multiple national championships, you can put up with having a year where you're a 7 or an 8 seed. And then if you're as good as Carolina is like they were last year, you can be pretty mediocre all season and then just say, we got 5 really good dudes. Let's see what they can do. And if not for an injury to Armando Bacot, I think they probably beat KU in the title game.
Yeah, definitely. And George is one of the players we wanted to talk about. Of course, he's not the first high-profile 5-star to come into this Baylor team. You had one in Kendall Brown last season. But I feel like George is just a different breed because of and he's a very different player because he's so gifted at scoring the basketball, which is not, Kendall Brown, it was the raw athleticism, the defensive ability, the athletic ability. And there's so many, Josh and I were talking before you hopped on it, that it almost seems like there's this unanimous thought that Keontae George is going to be the best freshman in the country. What do you think it is fair to expect out of him, and kind of what have you learned following this team about what this might look like when he actually takes the floor?
My normal heuristic is don't ever over-rely upon freshmen. Perry Jones was an elite recruit for Baylor, had a good freshman season. Scott Drew at the end of that season would even say, the guy averaged more points at Baylor than he did in his high school league, and a lot of people felt like his disappointing season. But that said, we gave the caveat. To give the final North Carolina analogy, the ceiling is the roof for Keontae George. No skill is more important in college basketball than the ability to get your own shot. Keontae George can do that in spades. Baylor played in a basketball tournament with some other universities this summer where they didn't have the success they wanted, but Adam Flagler and LJ Cryer didn't play in it. But Keontae George was the star of that tournament. His ability to create his own shot. He's gotten his body a little bit leaner this summer, working with Baylor's training staff, attending Chris Paul's camp. I would be shocked if he's not the Big 12 Freshman of the Year. And if he's not the Big 12 Player of the Year, it will be because either Mike Miles at TCU earns the award or Adam Flagler steps up and nabs it himself.
Assuming George is the player that he seems to be putting himself in a position to be, do you think that do LJ Cryer and Adam Flagler, what I'm getting at is I think Baylor has a chance to have the best backcourt in the country, and depending on who you ask right now, they'll tell you that they think Baylor has the best backcourt in the country. If you get the Adam Flagler and LJ Cryer, at least the healthy versions of them last year, and you get basically those same players again this year, and you add Keontae George to that, is that the best backcourt in the country? Or do you think there's a step that those other two guys, those returning players, need to take for that to really be the case?
I think it is. I would hear arguments within the Overton window for North Carolina with RJ Davis and Caleb Love back. And if you count Leaky Black as a backcourt guy as well, obviously a supreme defender. And then Houston with Marcus Sasser coming back and some elite recruiting. I think the Cougars have an argument too. But it's not just those 3 guys, and those are great guys to mention, Josh. It's Langston Love, who was a high 4-star recruit, had to miss all of last season with an ACL injury. And then Dale Bonner played 30-plus minutes at the end of the season, a lot for Baylor, an elite defender. And this kid, Daunton Grimes, who came in as a junior college player, is a heck of a lot better than Baylor thought they were. And so last year was kind of Baylor wasn't really as recession-proof as they hoped with a couple of the injuries. I think the backcourt for Baylor is so deep there that even if, let's say, what we don't want to have happen occurs and Adam Flagler goes down or LJ goes down, you feel like one of those guys can step up, and then you're just saying, all right, Keontae, your usage rate's now going to go up 5% compared to where it was. And you feel like it's a little bit more plug and play, whereas I'd be a little bit more worried if I were Carolina. And if RJ Davis goes down, I don't know that North Carolina has somebody that can step in and you feel like he's 90% of RJ Davis or 90% of Caleb Love.
And you mentioned Langston Love, and that was something else I wanted to touch on is you're bringing a bunch back in the backcourt. You just listed some of those names. Of course, you're hoping Langston Love stays healthy this season and he can make an impact. You've got both bigs returning, obviously not at the very beginning with Chama Chachua, but in theory, you've got Flo Thamba there, and hopefully you get Chama Chachua back at some point. There are also these other players that you're bringing into the equation, Langston Love because of his unavailability last season, but also Jalen Bridges, Caleb Lohner via the transfer portal. What do you feel like? There's such an established group already, and this team was so good last season with many of these returners playing key roles. What do you sort of expect to see, and has anything stood out to you about these other new pieces that are going to be factors into the equation this season?
Yep, I think two things stand out to me, Josh. The first is positional flexibility. 21 Baylor ended the year a lot with four guards playing when it was Adam Flagler, Jared Butler, Maceo Teague, Davion Mitchell. Then if they wanted to play Mark Vital at the 5 to close games or Jonathan Chamba Chachua, they could do that. This season, Baylor can easily go four guards with all the collection of talent we've talked about, or Jalen Bridges, I think, can close games, and Caleb Lohner can even play some small ball 5. The second thing, though, is I don't even know how to pronounce the guy's last name still, but it's Josh O. And I was talking to LJ Cryer last month, and I was like, LJ, how do you pronounce this guy's last name? And LJ was like, man, I don't even know still. But everybody I talked to, whether GAs, LJ, assistant coaches, they all tell me Josh O is way better than they thought right away. He played basketball in Africa, comes over to America. They just say his athleticism is off the charts. I was told by an assistant recently he can even shoot a little bit, put the ball on the floor. Elite defense where he can guard 1 through 5 at a level that is not pronounced by anybody else besides Jonathan Chamba Chachua. So I think Josh O is kind of the guy to watch if you're looking at Baylor and watching a game maybe with Baylor against Gonzaga and saying, who in the world is this guy from Baylor, and how do they keep getting these dudes from Africa that can just defend 5 positions every single season? Another guy they're ready to plug and play, and it sounds like a really good dude as well.
If I got a couple of questions here, and they kind of all come into the same idea of what do we think Baylor's ceiling is this year. The first one I ask you, kind of the first part is, are you worried at all about was it just a super unlucky collection of health in one season? Are you worried that it might carry over to the next year in terms of reoccurring injuries? I guess we'll start with there, and then I'll kind of go to the second point that kind of is wrapped into this expectation for this version of Baylor.
Yep, all have been very good questions. That's probably one of the big worries about Baylor is LJ Cryer has injuries to both feet, has some pretty serious surgeries on them. And so are those injuries he's just going to battle all season. So can the Bears really expect LJ to stay healthy all year? If they can, shot 45% from 3 last season. I think they'll have even better spacing this year with their full panoply of talent than they would last year. So that's great. But whether he can stay healthy, I think it's a fair question. I think for Adam, a little bit less of a question. The knee bothered him, but he played almost all of last season. And I don't think the injury was nearly as structural as LJ's 2 injuries to his feet were. So I think that is a fair concern for Baylor about how the health holds up on that front.
And the second part of kind of that, the second sub question is, what's your biggest area of concern for this team that if they get that right, you have a hard time believing they're not one of the 7 best teams in the country?
I think it's defensively. Baylor's offense, if Baylor doesn't have a top 5 offense, it means 3 guys just stop playing basketball. That's like how good this offense should be all year. But defensively, Baylor's wings were very underrated last season on that front. Kendall Brown could get beat on back cuts, but was a really good point of attack defender. Matthew Meyer, by Evan Miyakawa's analytics system, ranked him as one of the 2 best defenders in the country during last season, the best defender in the Big 12. And so without the wing defenders, and then Jeremy Sohan could play small ball 5, obviously was a top, I think, 7 pick in the NBA draft last season. Will Jalen Bridges and Caleb Lohner step up as wing defenders? And then James Akinjo is probably underrated as a point of the attack defender. So with Jonathan Chamba Chachua out, Flo Thamba is a good defender, but the defense could take a step back. And if you're, let's say, the number 2 offense, the number 28 defense, is that a recipe to win a national title? I think it's fair to wonder. Hopefully the defense can have a little bit higher ranking than that, but that might be where they end up, but hopefully not.
Building off of that for a second, I think that's a fascinating point, and something that doesn't necessarily get enough attention is both, these last 2 teams were built on, and you kind of alluded to this, that defensive versatility, whether it was Mark Vital or a guy like Jeremy Sohan last season. Is there and especially with Chama Chachua, at least missing an extended period, is there somebody you feel like if it ends up being 4 guards that is going to be kind of that versatile defender that can guard 1 through 5 or 1 through 4 that allows Baylor to play those four guards and not feel like you're sacrificing anything defensively? Because I feel like that's been kind of the secret is they're able to match up defensively. And then when you have four perimeter players that are as gifted as what Baylor's going to throw out there, it's impossible to guard when they have the ball.
That's a real concern, I think. The two guys you wonder about are Keontae George, because he's a little bit thicker, even with the body work he's done, and then Langston Love, because he's 6'4", and also a little bit of a thicker guy. Baylor relied upon Macy Otiga was 6'4" a lot during that championship season. So those are the two guys to watch for. But kind of as you mentioned there, Josh, you're talking about a true freshman and somebody who missed all of last season, so virtually a true freshman, having to step up defensively. So that does make me a little bit nervous, but they're not going to be nearly as bad defensively as Iowa. And at some level, that four-guard lineup might just say, what if Iowa's offense was even better? You didn't have to rely upon Luka Garza to defend people who know how to run, a sub-5 40.
So where do you think, let's kind of move into kind of bring Baylor into the conversation of everybody else in the conference. And we can start at the top. I think, I think we can all agree that it's certainly not a stretch to involve Baylor in the tippity top of this conference. And Kansas, like normal, is probably going to be there. Alongside those two teams, and maybe you don't think Kansas is going to be there, and you can certainly lay that out if you don't. But along with those two teams, are you expecting anybody to kind of be in the conversation at the very top of the conference, or are we going to look up, with 3 days left in January, and those two teams have kind of already separated themselves from the rest of the conference?
It's a good point. I guess I'll start with, I think KU is a bit overrated to start the year. I think KU is closer to team 15 nationally than a top 5 team nationally. So I think Jalen Wilson is good, but it's a lot to ask to go from you were Kansas's third best wing to now you are the guy that a lot of people think is going to be Kansas's best player this season. Christian Brown, sure. Ochai Agbaji obviously were relied upon a lot. And then at the end of the season, Remy Martin got to play a lot more in the tournament, seemed to take over in stretches for KU. With those guys gone, I don't think Jalen Wilson's going to handle the ball all the time, but you kind of wonder about him. And then Bobby Pettiford probably has to be a pretty big point guard for KU, whether they'll go 2 point guards with him. I wouldn't feel real confident if DeJuan Harris is my point guard. One of KU's least successful seasons recently was when Marcus Garrett, an exceptional defender, had to handle the rock because there's just not a lot of 3-point shooting when you have that defensive first point guard. Obviously, that leads to KU getting 30-pieced by USC in the NCAA tournament. So I'm a little bit lower on KU. Ceiling could be pretty high with Brady Dick as an elite freshman that Baylor certainly wanted in recruiting. Zach Clements looked pretty good as a big man in his few minutes last season. But I'm a little bit lower on KU. I think if there's a team that's getting some hype that I still believe in myself, it's TCU. Good season last year. Mike Miles decides to return. Almost all their core rotation pieces are back. Eddie Lampkin probably going to work on his body even more and was a dominant force in the campaign. So TCU, I think, could sneak up and scare people. But one of those deals where if you're called a sleeper by enough people, aren't we all awake about them eventually? I think that's fair to wonder about them. And then there'll be the reverberation of Texas was so overrated last season. Have we now underrated them this year with them adding Tyrese Hunter to their roster and then Marcus Carr coming back? Maybe I'm open to that, but still a lot of turnover in Austin. I just don't know if I buy it. And, at some level, I just respect Mark Adams a lot that I don't know that I want to pick Texas. So I think there's a case for Texas, but on principle, I refuse to make it.
Are you kind of approaching this? You just laid out some of the other teams that are kind of in that tier 2, I think, for most people. Do you see this as a 2-team race between Baylor and Kansas, at least to start the season? Or do you feel like it's one team, specifically Baylor, and then everybody else? Or do you feel like we're going to get to, February, the final weeks of the season, and there are going to be 3, 4, 5 teams that actually still feel like they have a chance to win this thing and mathematically haven't been eliminated from contention yet in terms of the very top of the conference?
I think healthy Baylor on paper is by far the best team in the league. I think if Baylor suffers an injury, so let's say LJ goes down, then I think Baylor's right there with KU, potentially TCU for sure. So I think if Baylor is healthy, I think Baylor will win the league by multiple games. I think Baylor will lose at Allen Fieldhouse, and I think they should be favored in every other game. I think, though, if LJ goes down or if you want to bet on one injury, then I think it becomes a 3-team race with KU, Baylor, TCU. I'm unwilling to say Texas. And I just don't ever know what to think with Texas Texans. Mark Adams is going to bring in 8 new dudes a year. I don't know, will they all gel? Will they all not gel? It feels like one of these years they're just not going to make the tournament, and then another year it'll be like, oh yeah, these 3 dudes hit, and now this team's 36-2 heading into the NCAA tournament. So Tech every year is like, I don't want to predict this team. I will not bet on this team, but I refuse to also hedge and bet against this team.
If you could describe a little bit your hesitations with Texas, kind of expand on that just a little bit. I think us here kind of know what you're getting at, but if you could expand for those who might be listening and aren't completely aware of kind of the Chris Beard era of Texas so far.
Sure. So my concern with Texas is they were so hyped to enter last season. They had all these transfers, and even at Big 12 Media Days, I asked Chris Beard, you got a lot of guys that think they're going to play 35 minutes a night. What the heck's going to happen to you? And he kind of scoffed at the question. He was like, we always play 8 guys, and they know who they are because the order sets itself up. Well, there were rumors last season about was Marcus Carr unhappy. Maybe those were just rumors. He came back to Texas this year. There were rumors about other guys not being happy. So I think whether the culture at Texas is where they want to be is a very fair question. A lot of turnover with the assistant coaches. They thought they were going to land Keontae George, went to Baylor, not Texas. So I just want to see it from Texas. I think Chris Beard's a very good season-based coach. But I also think if we want to get a little hot take-ish, it's fair to wonder if he kind of caught lightning in a bottle with Jarrett Culver being an unbelievable recruit relative to expectations, and that Mark Adams sort of popularized the no-middle defense once again at exactly the right moment. And if that combination worked out real well, and look, Chris Beard's still a top 20 coach in the sport, but if you're a top 20 coach and you got to go against Scott Drew, Bill Self, and Jamie Dixon in a season where he's got it rolling, and Mark Adams, who's going to use more duct tape than one of those weird kids who goes to prom in a duct tape dress, what are you going to do? And so I don't know. I just refuse to buy into Texas until I see it. I have that rule in football. I have that rule in basketball. It's a great academic school. Austin's a fun town. But I just got to see it from Texas before I'm going to buy their back.
You've mentioned some of specifically Texas Tech falls into this category, but I feel like the Big 12 is interesting this season in the sense that you have some teams that are heavily reliant on continuity and guys coming back, whether that's, TCU, Baylor to a certain extent. Of course, there are new pieces as well. There are some teams that are getting, and, Texas is also bringing an awful lot back. And then there are these other teams, whether it's Texas Tech, you can go down the list. Kansas is bringing in an awful lot of new pieces. There are a bunch of teams who are kind of retooling on the fly here. How important do you feel like that continuity is going to be in the Big 12 this season? And do you think it's going to be a deciding factor between, an example, a TCU and a Kansas, who from a roster building standpoint are kind of approaching this very differently, just considering what Kansas had to replace from last season and everything TCU just got to turn back over and make another run at it?
I think the continuity is very helpful. And I think, if you got Bill Self, True Serum, my guess is he would tell you he'd rather coach TCU's roster this season than his roster, though. You get a couple beers from Jamie Dixon, he'd probably tell you, oh my God, I'd love to coach the athletes KU has and have a chance to lead a roster like that. So who knows on that front, but I certainly would rather have the continuity of TCU. But by the time Big 12 play rolls around, KU will probably have dropped a couple of games where you're like, oh my God, how do they lose this game? And they'll find a way to sneak out a win against Baylor that you'll just be like, how does this happen? Bill Self every year finds a way to win a game or two that he just has no business winning and only he can win. So I would still rather have the continuity outside of Mark Adams, because I'll always trust Mark Adams with just a new roster every season. But those other newer teams, Iowa State, they did very well last season with the new roster. I thought they were clearly the worst team in the league, and they make the NCAA tournament, win a game in the tournament. So that's great for them. But I still wonder, a lot of new pieces this year, and you don't have a Tyrese Hunter caliber player coming in, though they've landed a 5-star for the next class. And then K-State, I think Jerome Tang will really get it going in Manhattan in 2024. But I don't expect K-State to be good this year. And, play this clip, Jerome Tang, if you want to say I'm a moron when you all make the NCAA tournament. But I would not expect a good year in Manhattan. I think football is more their sport this season than basketball.
On that topic real quick, what kind of coach is Kansas State getting in Jerome Tang, and how much did you get to interact with him during the course of your book? I'm just curious, as a guy who clearly has spent quite a bit of time around the program.
Yep. So I think Jerome Tang will be an excellent coach there. Already recruiting vastly better than Bruce Weber ever did in Manhattan, landing multiple high 4-star players already, getting some good transfers. So I think long-term will be a very great coach. He's been going to activities all throughout campus, really gotten engaged with campus life, which I think will give him some leeway if they're not very good this season. But I just don't think they have the guys this season, right? Everybody says you got to have the dudes, right? It doesn't matter if Bill Self's coaching K-State, doesn't matter who's coaching them. I don't think that backcourt is very good. I don't think they have kind of a winning team this season with the talent they have. So I'd be surprised if K-State won more than 3 Big 12 games. I think they're looking at like a 2-16 Big 12 season. But I think Tang, year 2 and 3, he's an energetic guy. He's a deeply caring guy. He's a smart guy. He looks for different advantages, and he's not afraid to change things up quickly. He wanted to be a Power 5 coach for a long time. This was a long time coming for him. He absolutely deserved it. He's a great guy. But I don't think anybody's winning year 1 in Manhattan. Put me on a video, put me on Twitter. Old Takes exposed me because I'm saying it now. K-State is not winning 5 Big 12 games. If they do it, I will write an apology letter to Marquise Noel. I will write Jerome Tang an apology letter. I will go to Manhattan myself and buy out Aggieville for the night. They'll always lend you money in America to do it. I just don't see it.
And this is something I've been talking about, and we've had this conversation on the podcast multiple times but I understand Jerome Tang wasn't going to leave for any job because, quite frankly, he was just above that at the point where he was getting real consideration for head coaching jobs. Do you have any explanation as to why it took a program of, a high major program, a program of Kansas State's caliber to actually land him? It blew my mind that after what he and Scott Drew inherited and what they built, that somebody wouldn't look at the primary assistant and go, you know what, it might be a good idea to hire that guy for our program.
It's one of those shocking things. It felt like for a very long time, a lot of schools were reluctant to say lead assistant can get a good job or even a Power 5 job. Tommy Lloyd's success last season at Arizona, I think, is really what unlocked it, because it said, hey, Gonzaga's been really good for a long time. Why not just give Tommy Lloyd a shot? Then Arizona becomes a dominant team last season. And I think you looked at Baylor, and Jeff Goodman did a list a few years back where he said, who's the top assistant in each conference? Tang won overwhelmingly for the Big 12, was the architect along with Al Brooks of Baylor's defense turning around during the 2020 and then 2021 campaign. So it was dumb. Athletic directors make a lot of dumb moves. I would guess if you have to spend half your life calling rich people to not make them mad when they've done stupid stuff, you'd probably get a little crazy yourself. So maybe that explains it. But yeah, America's athletic directors have a lot to answer for, and that will be on the list someday.
Are you? Is there even like 1% in the back of your brain that's a little like, I'm curious, hesitant about Baylor post Jerome Tang? Is there any of that for you?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Jerome Tang at Baylor was willing to wear whatever kind of hat he had to wear. I talked to somebody one time, it was like, is Tang kind of the bad cop? And multiple people have agreed with me since then, and that he was the guy who would get after people. He was the guy that if somebody wasn't working hard, he'd kind of, poke you and be like, hey, you're doing this, you're doing that, get after you, that kind of thing. And so somebody else has to sort of fulfill that role for Baylor. And that's going to be unique for him. Now, when they mentioned that Jerome Tang was a bad cop, they were like, our bad cop doesn't cuss. Our bad cop doesn't really get after you that much. And our bad cop will cry with you if you're having a bad day. But that's a role for somebody else to have. And so when I talked about the staff with somebody recently, they said they're still kind of learning what roles they all have to have. So I think it's fair to wonder if Baylor is bad or goes through a bad stretch, yeah, the bottom could really fall out for him without Tang there. But I think if Baylor's good, it's a lot easier to manage things, right? If things are good, you don't really have to wonder about, who's getting mad at us. But I think if Baylor takes a bad loss, then compounds that with a bad loss, where Tang might normally be able to walk in and just be like, this is unacceptable. I can't believe it. You're letting down your whole family. Well, that's not really Scott Drew's MO. That hasn't really been John Jacobs or Al Brooks' MO. Somebody else will have to do that. But you make the kind of money these men are making, I think you can convince yourself to be a little passive aggressive to the fellas.
And we also wanted to touch on sort of the future of this conference and from a Baylor perspective, teams are coming in 2023, Oklahoma and Texas are going to leave. What has it kind of been like sort of being in Big 12 country as this has all happened? And what do you feel like, this is going to be theoretically the last season of the Big 12 looking like we've sort of come to know it for decades almost at this point? Of course, there's been some movement here or there, but there are these staples, and now all of a sudden, Cincinnati and BYU are coming in, and then you're going to say goodbye to Texas and Oklahoma. Just what has this been like, and what do you feel like? Is there going to be some sort of underlying storyline here this season about this being the last time the Big 12 looks like this?
I think in basketball, the Big 12 is in a lot more stable footing. By Ken Palm's rankings, the Big 12 actually gets better, dropping Texas and Oklahoma and adding Houston, BYU, Cincinnati, and then UCF doesn't really count. But, if you add them as well, they still are better. So I think Baylor's in a good spot. I think if the Big 12 can add 4 Pac-12 schools, there's still some rumors about, will the Big 10 ultimately add, whether it's Cal, Washington, Stanford, and Oregon, to get that late night TV window for an Amazon package. And then if that happens, I think the 4 corner schools come to the Big 12. And then I feel bad for Oregon State and Washington State, but somebody was going to get betrayed in this whole organization. I think Baylor's in an okay spot because NIL money seems to flow to brands, and Baylor's kind of become a brand where they're okay getting guys there. I think the sport's also going to have to undergo a pretty big restructuring once all the one-and-done guys start going pro. I don't know how John Calipari is going to coach differently, but you'd feel pretty confident for Baylor that they were landing the 5-star guys at the early part of the last decade with Perry Jones and Quincy Miller, Isaiah Austin. That recruiting pipeline kind of dries up. There are some on the Baylor side that will say they didn't have the ability to drop the bags and some of these schools would drop. I'm not saying that, and I'm not naming names for anybody from Baylor who would say that. But they might say, hey, it was interesting how all of a sudden the same 7 schools got all these guys. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm just saying an interesting concept to consider. So I think the concern you might have, though, in realignment is if the Big Ten and the SEC have this much money, are they going to decide to pay their football coach $90 million a season? Texas A&M probably will. They're already giving, Jimbo $95 million to not win games. But will other schools want to do that? I don't think so. What I think will ultimately happen is they'll pay the players, because if you really want to be dominant in the SEC and the Big Ten, it doesn't make sense to just pay your football coach $40 million more a year than the Big 12 could. It makes sense to spread that money out and say, why come to Baylor and play football when you can come to Wisconsin and get $400,000 a year? So I'd be a little bit worried about, does that revenue then go to basketball? I'm also just worried about the health of the sport, because greed always seems to win out in this. Will they just decide the NCAA tournament is the 68 best Power 5 plus 10 schools, which would be the Power 5 plus 10 schools? That's my concern for the health of the sport. But I think Baylor's in an okay spot because Keontae George is at Baylor because of outside money, not because Baylor was able to give him a lot of money themselves, and because of the brand, Baylor's ability to put guys in the NBA. So I think the Baylor brand will still be strong going forward. But I think football-wise, it is fair to wonder what the heck's going to happen to the Big 12 and the SEC and the Big 10 are making ungodly sums of money, because I don't understand why CBS and NBC are paying for Indiana Rutgers. But, by God, maybe I don't understand what New Jersey versus Indiana means for America.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent my entire life in Big Ten country, and I don't even know what Big Ten country is at this point because, it's the entire 48 states. So
it's C2 shining sea.
That's right.
Los Angeles versus College Park, Maryland.
Absolutely. It doesn't get much better than that. Well, Kendall, thank you so much for taking the time. Really enjoyed it. And we'll be following you and Baylor this season. Thanks so much.
Yep. Appreciate it, fellas. Thanks.